Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Andrew, for inviting me, and thank you for seeing the article in the paper about the Mojave River. You know, it's interesting listening to Tex talk about, you know, his introduction with the Historical Society here. Our Historical Society in San Bernardino is a lot of parallels here. We get probably about the same. I don't know how many people are here, maybe, I don't know, it's 50 people, or I'm not sure how many people are here. We usually get about that, about 40 to 60, 70 people. We are open, you know, every month. We also own the building and the premises. And I usually started all our programs off by saying, you know, welcome everyone, and, you know, we're open to the public, free of charge. And I mentioned that one of the great things about our Historical Society is that we own this whole place. And I say the bad thing about our Historical Society is that we own this whole place, and we're nonprofit. So that's my lead-in for getting donations too. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. My interest in the Old West, and it's better to stand over here, or no, I'll sit right here. When I was a young boy, I grew up in New Jersey. I'm a New Jersey boy. 12 years old is when my family and we crossed the plains on Route 66 in a station wagon, not a covered wagon. We moved to San Bernardino, California. Prior to that, in New Jersey, I remember watching Westerns on TV in the early 60s. And those of you that are old enough to remember, there were shows like Lawman, Rifleman, Bronco, Cheyenne, Bonanza, you name it. They're all wonderful shows. And I thought they were all accurate until I found out they're not so accurate. One of those shows that I remember only in name and the music, and the fact that Hugh O'Brien starred in it, was called The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp. So shortly after we moved to San Bernardino, California, I found out that this was very much part of the West, all of California. And Wyatt Earp and his family spent much of their lives, in fact, most of their lives, out here. Of all the Western personalities, you have Geronimo, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Wild Bill Hickok. Probably no one has been written about as much as both as a hero or as a villain, depending on who you're listening to. And also, then Wyatt Earp. And the fact that Wyatt and to a lesser extent, his brothers, there's stories about him, there's articles written about him in books, magazines, starting out with dime novels, TV shows like The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, movies, classic movies like My Darling Clementine, that I thought was a very accurate movie. It's a wonderful movie. And of course, there's more and more and more. He's billed as a villain and also as a hero. And in between, and what you really find out, as I've done my research on the Earps and talking to historians that know more about Wyatt Earp than I do, find out that he was not the celluloid image on the silver screen or this picture on a magazine. He was a real person, real three-dimensional person living in an era that was different from what we live in today. I wrote a book in 2006 called The Earp Clan, The Southern California Years. And I have copies in the back table there, as well as a book I wrote about San Bernardino, pictorial history called Images of America, San Bernardino, California. Started with the story of the Earps in Southern California begins in 1851. That year, Nicholas Earp and his family, with his 5 children, were living in Monmouth, Illinois. He heard about this gold rush up in Northern California, and like many people, decided he was going to go strike it rich, bring back the goods for his family. So he left sometime in 1851 and eventually into early 1852, went over to the gold rush country, Northern California, and he stopped in a little town they call it at the time they call it Hangtown. Today it's known as Placerville. I don't know for sure if he ever put a pick in the ground or actually really dug for gold. What I do know is that he ran with a partner, ran a mercantile store. And that's how a lot of people made some money in those gold rush towns. After a short time, he decided he had enough up there. He wasn't going to make it real big. So he started working his way back to the Midwest, back to Illinois. And we don't know why, but he ventured down to Southern California. And there he stopped in the San Bernardino Valley. And he vowed that someday he would come back. And he did in 1864, 13 years later. This is Nicholas Earp, Nicholas Porter Earp. Family and friends portray him as a man who saw the world in black and white. You either liked him or you didn't like him. People that weren't too crazy about him said he was very profane. Now, profane back in the 1860s was probably not quite as profane as today. But they probably use a lot of words like SOB and you know, whatever. But anyway, he was kind of a tough codger. 1864, he decided to come back to California and go back to San Bernardino. He and the Earps, his family, and 3 other families were part of a wagon train that came out west. Nick Earp, because he had been here before, 13 years earlier, he was named as wagon master. The 4 families that came out were the Curtis family, the Rousseau family, the Hamiltons, and the Earps. This is Wyatt Earp in 1869. When the Earps came out here in 1864, he was a few years younger. And so that's pretty much what he looked like minus 4 years. Wyatt was 16 when he came out. This is Morgan Earp, the second youngest brother. This is when he was 30. That's the youngest picture I have him. But he was only about 13 when he came out, 1864. Adelia was 3 years old. This is the only Earp sister to live into adulthood. This is older brother James. I call him the forgotten older brother. I don't know how many people have ever heard of James Earp. Maybe if you watch the movie Tombstone. No, actually, in Tombstone, he was in that one. He was in the movie Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner. Shows James Earp in there. James was just discharged from the Union Army. He was injured in Fredericktown. And he followed the family out west. Let's see. Went as far as Austin, Nevada. This is the youngest brother, 9-year-old Baxter Warren, or Warren Earp. Warren Earp had all the Earp boys had a temper growing up. They all were good fighters. They all learned a lot of that from their father, who had a good temper, a big temper, and a good fighter. The older boys were able to calm their temper, and especially Wyatt was known for his coolness. Youngest brother Warren never could. And he was really the kind of the tragic brother of the family. 9 years old, he came out with the family, and he got into several scrapes with other kids on the wagon train. This is their trek right here. They left Pella, Iowa on May 12th, 1864, arrived in San Bernardino, California on December 17th. If you do the math, that's over 7 months. So whether or not the 4 families got along well in the beginning, after a while they didn't. I mean, and I think when you're traveling 3 miles an hour on a good road on a good day, it's pretty tough. Part of the trek was through the Cajon Pass. This is part of the trail they went through along the John Brown Toll Road in Cajon Pass. Still there today. This is another section showing the Cajon Pass. The Brown Road right down here in the bottom here was the old Spanish Trail, Mule Caravan Trail, and this was a wagon road, and that's where the Earps came up. And they were headed for San Bernardino. This is what downtown San Bernardino looked like in 1865. If you were to walk outside of City Hall today, if you know where that is, on 3rd and D Street, look eastbound, and that's what you would have seen. San Bernardino was known. When the Mormon families were there in the beginning, in the 1850s, it was a law-abiding town. However, Brigham Young, the president of the Mormon Church, recalled his faithful back to Salt Lake, and the character of the town changed. In fact, the corner of 3rd and D Street was known as Whiskey Point because there was a saloon at each corner. One of the people, this is James Rousseau, who was a physician. He was the husband of Sarah Jane Rousseau. And well, I can show you, this is James Rousseau right up here, and just some other members of San Bernardino that were very important to the county. Sarah Jane wrote a diary, and I've got a copy of the entire diary. I got a copy from a descendant of the Rousseau family. And she wrote each day about their travels, and she would talk about stuff like, well, Jimmy Hatton fell off the wagon, or a cow ran off, or birds and the bees and everything, you know. But she also talked about, she was probably bored, but she was talking about Indians and really being scared. Not once were they ever attacked, but there were Indians that were curious, so they would just give food out. Of course, Sarah Jane Earp was not too crazy about Nick Earp, and said that he was very profane, he was very hard to get along with, and also he didn't want to give any free food out to the Indians. Well, she was concerned that they were going to die, you know, but anyway, they just grinned and bared it and put up with Nick. Of course, Nick was a wagon master, and he had to hold everybody together, so you have to give him some credit. This is Reverend Israel Curtis. He started First Baptist Church in San Bernardino. He had a family of 16 people. When the Earps when the families first arrived in San Bernardino, they camped out near Meadowbrook Park, which is near Mountain View Avenue and 3rd Street in San Bernardino. The Earps then rented a farm near the Zanja, which is a Spanish word for ditch. And it was an irrigation ditch that was dug out by the local Indians. And it's in today's northern part of Redlands. 2 years later, they moved to Old San Bernardino. They called that when they started building the city of San Bernardino, and it's now in today's Loma Linda. They settled down on Cottonwood Row, a dirt road that was lined with the creek as well as cottonwood trees, now known as Mission Road. Virgil Earp. Virgil didn't go out with, he was still in the Union Army. This is really, what's strange, it's just amazes me how people can travel, across country, and leave a cushy home, and then also take a chance and spend 7 months traveling across the country. Also, Virgil Earp was in the Union Army. He found, by the time he was discharged, the family was already moved to the San Bernardino Valley, or what is now North Redlands. Somehow Virgil found out where they were, and he moved in with them. One of Wyatt Earp's, the Earp's neighbors, basically it was Nick Earp and his wife, and Wyatt was 16 years old, and then Virgil eventually joined them. They were younger siblings. They had a neighbor named Horace Monroe Frink, who he and his brother started a freighting business through the San Bernardino County, from San Bernardino through what is now Redlands, the San Timoteo Canyon, all the way through Riverside County up to the border into Arizona. One of the people that he hired, according to Stuart Lake, who wrote the biography of Wyatt Earp, which has some fallibilities about it, but a lot of truth, is that Horace Monroe Frink hired him as a 16-year-old to work as a freighter. And there is documentation that he did. Also, there's a family that lived not too far from where the Franks lived, where the Earps lived, and there's by the name of Clanton. Have you ever heard of the Clantons? Newman Haynes Clanton was a widower. He and his kids, they traveled different parts of Southern California. Eventually, they settled in San Timoteo Canyon, which is near what is today's city of Redlands. They were there at the same time the Earps were there. Now, there's no documentation that they ever knew each other, but considering there weren't many farms out there near San Bernardino on the outskirts of town, it's a good chance that they may have both known each other, and who knows, maybe they were friends at one time, or maybe they had a long-standing feud that came to a tilt on October 26, 1881 in Tombstone. This is Joseph Isaac I. Clanton. Supposedly he went to school in one of the Franks. 1868 is 1876. The Earps are back in the Midwest, and the boys are feeling their oats. Nick Earp, the father, decided for various reasons to go back to the Midwest. He had some land he wanted to sell. Also, a problem that he had is that none of the boys wanted to work on the farm. Wyatt Earp felt like he wasn't cut out for farming. None of the boys wanted to do farming. So they went back to the Midwest. They went to Missouri, then they went to Illinois. The Earp boys, the older brothers, James, Virgil, and Wyatt, they decided they didn't like the farming life and they wanted adventure. So they got involved with buffalo hunting. Wyatt was involved with buffalo hunting. They were self-proclaimed capitalists, opportunists. So they would go to where the boomtowns were. So Dodge City was one of those towns where Wyatt and Morgan spent time at as assistant marshal, and also they ran a saloon. Wyatt Earp met a man named Bartholomew Masterson. Bartholomew and his brother Ed were buffalo hunters. And Wyatt, for a short time in 1874, was also a buffalo hunter. And he met him. Bartholomew probably didn't like his name Bartholomew, so he shortened it to Bat. You probably heard of Bat Masterson. In Dodge City, they both worked on the police force and became lifelong friends. That's Bat Masterson standing up and Wyatt Earp sitting down. Also, while Wyatt would go, part of the year he'd go to Fort Griffin, Texas. Then he would go back to Dodge City when the cows were coming in during the cattle droves. He was going wherever the money was, wherever the opportunity was to run a saloon. So while he was in Fort Griffin, Texas, he met John Henry Holliday, who was a dentist. He was very educated for his time. He probably had 2 years of college. I'm not sure. But anyway, John Henry, or Doc Holliday, developed a real bad case of tuberculosis or consumption. He knew he was a dying man, and his attitude reflected that. Again, a lifelong friend of Wyatt Earp, but he was an enemy of a lot of people. Nick and Virginia Ann, that's Nick Earp's wife, they returned to Southern California and they settled in Temescal Canyon. Anybody here know where Temescal is? You do? Okay, Temescal Canyon, it's basically it's on the way to about halfway to it's on the 15, go to San Diego. There's a Glen Ivy hot springs nearby, and there's Lake Elsinore not too far away. They were there for about 2.5 years before they moved to Colton, little town of Colton. That was Nick Earp and Virginia Ann and his youngest kids. Morgan, actually, at this time it was Warren and Adelia. Morgan had gone up to Montana. Wyatt was in, of course, Dodge City, and stayed there for a while, and Virgil was in Arizona. So the fighting Earp boys had better ideas. They didn't like that settled down life. This is Nick Earp at 65 years old. Kind of look at him, looks like he chewed nails for breakfast. He looks pretty tough. They said he was very well liked if you liked him. That's it. When Nick Earp and his wife and Morgan came down from Montana in early 1880, he was with his brother James, went down and met him in Temescal, and Morgan's wife wrote a letter to her sister Agnes. She says, "Dear Sister Agnes, your kind and most welcome letter is at hand. I'm very glad to hear from you and to hear you are well. This has me quite well at present, and I sincerely hope when this comes to hand, it will find you all enjoying the best of health. My husband starts for Arizona in the morning. He's going to Tombstone. I am going to stay here for the present with his parents. They do not want me to go, and I do not want to go, so I think I will stay here this summer." Eventually, she did go. And eventually, after the gunfight, the so-called gunfight at OK Corral, short time later, 3 months later, Morgan was ambushed and killed. And that's when he came back to San Bernardino Valley in a coffin. This is what Tombstone looked like in 1880 Well, 1879, when Virgil and Wyatt arrived in December of 1879, Morgan arrived the next year. This is what the mining town looked like. Originally it was called Goose Flats. And then they renamed it Tombstone. That was the name of the first silver mine that was founded by Ed Shefflin. In fact, what people told him before he found silver, they said, Ed, the only thing you're going to find out there is your tombstone. So that's why his first mining claim, he called it Tombstone. Virgil Earp, 1882, this is what he looked like, and he was 39 years old. He was, for a while, he was city marshal of Colton. Wyatt Earp, of Tombstone. Wyatt Earp in 1886, a few years later, this is when he was in San Diego. This is what he looked like while he was in Tombstone, too. Big handlebar mustache. Morgan Earp again, same photo, 30 years old. This is a site, this is a site of where, or near the OK Corral. The gunfight was not in a corral, it was in an alley near the corral, and eventually it spilled out into Fremont Street. That's pretty much where the shootout was. Meanwhile, the California Earps, they moved on to Colton. Nick Earp joined a group called the San Bernardino Society of California Pioneers. In fact, the historical society I belong to is called the San Bernardino Historical and Pioneer Society. It's part of that old group that was founded in 1888, but it merged with a new group. People that in this group here, Nick Earp is not in this photo, but some names you may have heard before. William F. Holcomb, the namesake for Holcomb Valley. There's John Brown Jr., John Brown Sr., both were mountain men, grizzly bear. They all were grizzly bear hunters, if you can imagine that. George Miller and B.B. Harris. They look like they're all armed for combat, but basically it was a publicity photo, but they did use those guns for hunting. This is Nick Earp and Virginia Ann when they're celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in Colton, California. Wyatt, when he was in Tombstone, he had a wife named Maddie. It was a common law wife. Of course, that was very common back then, too, not getting married. Supposedly she was hooked on laudanum, which is a form of opiate, a type of heroin. The family, the wives, the other brothers really liked her a lot. I don't know if Wyatt was ever close to her or not. Supposedly, one rumor is that he met her in a brothel, because at one time he was an opportunist. He ran a brothel at one time, or took part in it. While they were in Tombstone, he met this young lady named Sarah Josephine Marcus. He called her Sadie. And she was a girlfriend of Johnny Behan, who was a county sheriff of Cochise County, and later on became an enemy of Wyatt Earp and actually contributed to the gunfight, the cause of the gunfight. But this is what Josephine Marcus Earp, later on became Earp, because they got together and they wound up living together for the rest of their lives. Supposedly they were married a few years later. Wyatt died in 1929. She lived until 1944. So this photo here is accredited to be her, Sarah Josephine Marcus Sadie Earp. Now, well, this one here, is this why Sadie didn't want to be mentioned in Wyatt's biography? Historian Glenn Boyer, in his book, uses this photo and said, this is Wyatt, this is Josie or Sadie Earp when she was about 19 years old. A lot of speculation that this is not her. It actually was a photo that was taken some years later. Glenn Boyer, to his last days, said it was her. And he said, if it's not her, it should be her. So I don't know what that means. Supposedly she was a real looker, so I don't know how you get the credibility there. But I don't know, you can go back maybe, let's see, let's go back to the, okay. I mean, look, I don't know how good you are with faces and all that. Could that be her? Maybe, I mean, could be. But it's a pretty risque outfit. And so anyway, she was a member of a dance troupe, it's called a Pinafore dance troupe from San Francisco. But I don't know. We don't know what else she did. This is Starkey Stagecoach. This is San Bernardino. This is the oldest commercial building in San Bernardino today. This building is still there today. On D Street between 3rd and Court Street. Starkey's Hotel, that's gone now. That was downtown. That's one of their old buildings. During the time when the Earps were there. After the gunfight in Tombstone, and Virgil was injured. He almost died. He was ambushed on December 28, 1881. 3 months later in March, Morgan was killed, all by members of the Clanton gang. Morgan's body and Virgil, who was injured, were sent by Southern Pacific Railroad back to Colton, where his parents were living. Virgil recuperated from his injuries, although he lost the use of his left arm. However, he still he worked as a special detective for the Southern Pacific Railroad. He was a town constable of Colton, and then when Colton became a city, he was the first city marshal, even though he only had one arm that he was using. His house is still standing today at 528 8th Street in Colton. Virgil and Allie Earp. 1883, he was involved with an interesting thing when he was working for the Southern Pacific before he became city marshal, and he was barely recuperating from his injuries. He was involved with a railroad dispute. The California Southern, which eventually became known as the Santa Fe, Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad, and now it's BNSF, were laying tracks from San Diego northbound and eventually going through the Cajon Pass and connecting with the eastern lines. In order to come up this way, they had to cross over the Southern Pacific tracks, which had spurned. The Southern Pacific spurned, well, I say San Bernardino missed about 10 years earlier when they for $100,000, they refused to have them lay their tracks, and then they lost the boat. Colton became a town, and San Bernardino had nothing. Well, now San Bernardino is finally going to have a railroad coming through. But at this crossing, you see where the lines crisscross. There's now an overpass, so that's gone now. But during that time in 1883, before the California Southern laid their tracks over the Southern Pacific, Virgil Earp was hired by the Southern Pacific as a special detective. He was sitting in this document, he was sitting in a little locomotive at the would-be crossing armed with arsenal. He had a gun, daring the California Southern for crossing over. And he was told to use it if anybody crossed over. So people in Colton, of course, they wanted the railroad, the citizens. The citizens in San Bernardino wanted their railroad too. And according to eyewitnesses, people were arguing, there were fights, they were using picks and shovels, and there was almost like the Hatfields and McCoys. Eventually, the future governor, Governor Waterman, who was a future governor of California, and the county sheriff put a stop to it, told Virgil to put down his arsenal, and they gave the okay to lay the tracks across. And that was it. A couple years later, while Virgil was living in Colton, and after the gunfight at the OK Corral, there was a silver mining strike in the Mojave Desert called Calico. Started in 1881. Virgil and James went out there about 1885, and it looks very possible that Wyatt was there for a short time too. They were mentioned about opening James and Virgil were mentioned about opening a faro table there, running a game, but they really didn't make too much. I think by the time they got there, the silver strike was on its way out. The Clyde Ranch in Lone Pine Canyon. Now, this is not the Lone Pine up here. There's a Lone Pine Canyon near the Cajon Pass. And the Clyde family moved out in that area there in the 1860s. They purchased, they just took an old cabin and added on to it. And during the 1870s, Virgil Earp became real good friends with Alman Clyde. And he would come and visit. He would hunt on the property, and he would stay there for a couple of weeks just camping out. And his brother Wyatt would come also, but especially Virgil. In fact, I talked to Bob Clyde maybe about 20 years ago. He's passed on now. He mentioned that Virgil had loaned his father, or a grandfather, I should say, a hay baler for baling hay. And when Alman Clyde was finished with it, he said, come, I'll drop it off, or you can come pick it up. And Virgil said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll pick it up one of these days." And anyway, Virgil died in 1905, and the hay baler is still there today. It's in pieces, but it's still there. That cabin was just burned in 2016 Blue Cut fire, so that cabin is now gone, unfortunately. This house is on D Street. It's still standing today, 1068 D Street. This was a home of Adelia Edwards. Now, people wonder, who's Adelia? Well, he was their Earp sister. So Adelia Earp married Bill Edwards, and she lived most of her life in Yucaipa, Highland, San Bernardino. They moved around a lot, but all in the same area, and that's one of her houses. In 1893, the love of Nick Earp's life, Virginia Ann, died. He was heartbroken, but 6 months later, he remarried. So I don't know. Men are weak. I don't know what it is, or maybe I'm sure he really did. He, as a member of the Pioneer Society, I mentioned that his personality was varied. People liked him or didn't like him, but he was a great storyteller. And he met this elegant woman named Annie Alexander, who just became a widow. Her husband had just died a short time before that. And she just probably loved his stories. And possibly Nick Earp saw in Annie maybe a younger version of his wife. It could be. And anyway, they were married. They probably only lived together maybe about 5 months, and they really stayed married in name only. Because for the most part, Nick Earp would live with his daughter, and Annie lived with her kids in parts of San Bernardino. But this is Nick Earp right here, and that's Annie, 30 years younger right here. He was 80 and she was 50. 1906, Wyatt Earp wanted to get away from it all. Well, sorta. He was involved with, not only the gunfight in Tombstone, he got out of that. Where he was arrested, he was exonerated for being on the good side of they said the clans were on the wrong and the Earps were on the right side. 1896 in San Francisco, he was a boxing referee. It was Fitzsimmons and Sharkey. It was a heavyweight fight. I'm not sure the date, but it was in 1896. And he, as a referee, there's a lot of money that were given to the favored person. And I try to remember now if it was Fitzsimmons or Sharkey. So I'm going to give those names intermixed. Whatever one it was, Wyatt claimed that the opponent punched below the waist, and he gave the fight to the other person. That created an uproar because people were losing money galore. And Wyatt Earp became, again, embroiled in controversy. So people were writing all kinds of stuff about him, and he decided he had enough. He and his wife, Sadie, or Josie, they decided they were going to go out in the southeastern corner of the Mojave Desert. They filed on some mining claims. They called them the Happy Day Mines. They were copper mines with basically mostly copper with low-grade silver. So they really didn't make a whole lot of money. They had people. He was known to be very generous to his friends, and he let his friends do the mining and keep whatever they had. So he just went there to have it where it's real quiet. They had a campsite out in the desert. They settled in a little town called Vidal. And but Wyatt Earp just could not be live that tranquil existence for too long. When it got to the hottest time of the year, they went to cool climate. They went to Los Angeles. Wow, that was supposed to be cooler. I guess it's cooler than the Mojave Desert. And also, he worked for the LAPD, and he got involved with some more stuff. This is his campsite, Wyatt and Sadie's campsite, 1905 to 1920s. Now, if you look up here, look where the tent is. Look up this hill here. There's two little rocks here. And this is right here, two rocks there. I took this picture in 2006. Actually, I've got some earlier photos, too. So my friend Mike Stubbs and his son somehow found out where that campsite was. And he took me out there in 1995. I've been there several times since. And now they're in several books because people have found out about Mike took a few people, more people out, and next, they pilfered the place, really. But anyway, but when he and I went out there, we probably, there were tin cans, and it looked like a place had not been touched. There was even a tree house with some old steps in it where Josie Earp mentioned about James building a tree house for her. Anyway, that's me with a New York Yankee hat on. I didn't have my cowboy hat that day. And Mike, and we're standing outside the one of the holes entries to the Lucky Day Mine. Back then, there was an ore car, a track going through there. The ore track is gone now. And that's one of the things that happens. There also were bats in that cave too. Yeah, Wyatt and Sadie also had a cabin, and this was I had never seen. I went to look for it, and it was already gone by then. This picture was taken in probably the 1950s, and it was located near where that other tent cabin was, and later on was moved to what is now called Earp, California. It was called Drennan. Originally, now it's called Earp. There's a post office there. I think it's still operating, but there are no residences there. It's a town with nobody. This is Wyatt Earp here. No. This is me and Wyatt at Sadie's home in Vidal, November 2013. This house is still standing today. Ironically, it's owned by a Clanton. Terry I. Clanton, and very interesting guy. He's involved with the movie business. Nothing really major, but I mean he's really good, very talented. He loves playing the spoiler at Tombstone events. The other side of the story. But here, Terry I. Clanton owns the only maybe the only house that the Earps ever owned. Okay, at the same time, they lived out in the desert. Then they go back to L.A. And this young man named Arthur Moore King. Arthur King, in the late 1950s, for True West magazine, was interviewed, and he mentioned he was Wyatt Earp's last deputy. And a lot of stuff is documented. He was Wyatt's deputy because when Wyatt worked for the LAPD, part-time, he was 60 years old, he figured he had to do something, he can only just be tranquil for so long. Arthur mentioned that in 1909, they were involved with several chases of bandits, or I say, outlaws crossing the Mexican border. And one particular time, he mentioned about this guy named Pearson, who was he was a drug addict, he was a murderer. I'm not sure how many other things he did, but they were instructed or asked by the LAPD to find these guys. So they went and they knew he was going down to San Diego. He followed them to San Diego. Then they crossed the border, the Mexican border. And Arthur King mentioned that back then it would take sometimes a couple of years to extradite somebody from below the border to bring him back here. So they would do things kind of on the shady side of the law. I mean, that's how things were back then. You just have to do something a little different. So they would dress up like farmers. They didn't dress up. They went across the border. They found out where Pearson's camp was. How they did, I don't know, but they found him. They pointed guns at him. They arrested him. They put handcuffs on him. Got him on a horse. Went back to the border. And when they got to the border, Arthur King was on the Mexican side. He did his feet, ties around his feet, had him push him across the border, and Wyatt Earp was there with a warrant to arrest him. That's what he said. I mean, supposedly they were involved, and it sounds like a kind of maybe a little fishy story. Is it true? This one here, though, is true. This was a couple years later, and I know that Russ Kohlenberg, was it Kohlenberg? Did he give a presentation recently on Trona? Well, there's a big fight over Potash fields near Searles Lake, near Trona, which is not too far from here, 30 miles from here. And Wyatt Earp, again, was asked by was it Tom Parsons to represent a mining a syndicate called the American Trona Company, led by Lee and Associates, against the California Trona Company. Both groups claim ownership, possession of the potash fields, which were used for explosives during the beginning of just before World War I. So Wyatt, he was, again, this is on the shady side of the law. He was targeted by the police, and he went out with 33 men and went out to near Cyril's Lake. And according to Lou Razor, it's been documented in the newspaper, documented on files, that he had these men camped out waiting for this other group to come the next morning, because they both claimed to have the right to these potash fields, and they were armed. In fact, the next morning, Stafford Austin, who was a federal receiver, came over, and he came up with the California Trona Company, and he wanted to arrest Earp and his group. Earp grabbed a gun from one of Austin's men and pointed it at him. And then he came back with a rifle. And Lou Razor mentioned 6 years later when they went to court that it was the bravest thing he had ever seen. He described the whole affair. Interestingly enough, in 1910, during this time when they faced each other, they argued, then all of a sudden they put down their guns and they broke for breakfast. I mean, I know there's that saying, keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. I don't know if that was the case or not. But anyway, in 1916, when they went to court, it was decided that the opposite party, the California Trona Company, had possession. They were, basically said that they were in the right side of the law. So if you look at it, you could say that Wyatt Earp was represented claim jumpers. And that maybe, I'm not sure if our speaker mentioned that or not, but it depends on what side of the fence you're on. If the other side won, it'll be the other way around. But anyway, that's it. Yeah. Interesting man. This is Jim Fairchild. Anybody know Jim? He's involved with the Trona Historical Society. This is about 10 years ago. I spoke to the Trona group, and he took me out to basically the site where the men were had the would-be gunfight, I guess you'd say. Jim Fairchild. Ray Spoladoro was a neighbor of my parents after I had moved out of the house. I met her in about 1989. She was in her 90s then. She was 98 years old when she died. She knew Wyatt Earp in the 1920s, and some really valuable information from her, because she was in her 20s. It wasn't like she was 3 years old or hearsay. She knew the man and talked about his personality and what he was like. She mentioned that he was very good friends with her father, Charlie Welsh, that they met each other in Needles. They also went up to Alaska together and eventually to Los Angeles. In fact, when Wyatt died, it was Charlie Welsh's family, his wife and family, that took care of the funeral arrangement. Grace mentioned that when Wyatt would come over to the house, he was very cordial with the women, very polite, but really quiet. He was always choosy with his words, but he was really a talkie, with the men. And she mentioned one time that she mentioned about his deliberateness. He was very polite. He was, in his younger days, he was about 6 feet tall, weighed about 150 pounds. Now, 6 feet tall, 150 pounds sounds, looks like a rail. But he was described as being strong, wiry. I mean, it's, back then they didn't have McDonald's and donut shops, so they probably, they lived well. But anyway, Wyatt was maybe getting a little paunchiness then when she knew him. But she mentioned one time at a family get-together, because Wyatt was always invited over as part of the family, one of her uncles got belligerent. I guess he had too much to drink, and he said something that was profane, whatever profane was. And Wyatt Earp, all of a sudden, was real quiet. He just stood up, looked at the man, And he said, you don't, he had a deep voice. He said, you don't talk to a woman like that. Or you don't talk in front of a woman like that. And she said that you could have heard a pin drop. Everybody just sat down and went back to what they were doing. She said that he had these steely blue eyes that could stare right through you. And that was Wyatt. In 1920, he got to know this actor named William S. Hart. Have you ever heard of William S. Hart? You know, by 1920, Wyatt was, you know, he was involved with so many things. So a lot of things were controversial. And things were written about him, especially right after the Tombstone gunfight, as well as the Sharkey Fitzsimmons fight in San Francisco. And most of what was written, he felt that it was erroneous, it was mean-spirited, it was also, he just said it was wrong. I mean, some things were just, they even built him up as this knight on a white horse, and he really didn't want quite like that either. So he met William S. Hart because Wyatt always knew the right people. And he was involved with Jack London, with Tex Picard, who was a boxing promoter. He met William S. Hart. Hart was enthralled with Wyatt Earp. And Wyatt, the two of them became very good friends and exchanged letters. And Wyatt asked Hart he said to Hart that he would love to have Hart portray him in a movie. He would like to have somebody portray him that could really show the real Wyatt Earp. So William S. Hart was going to do that. Unfortunately, by the 1920s, his fame was starting to wane. I mean, William S. Hart was popular 10 years earlier. He was already kind of going down, you know, as a, you know, say a has-been, but not as popular as he was. There was a young guy coming up, his name was Tom Mix. But he was more of a fancy dandy actor. And Wyatt, even though Wyatt became good friends with him, he thought Hart was the guy to do it.
Tom Mix was my hero.
Was he? Okay, good. You know what? I think Tom Mix cried at Wyatt Earp's funeral, or he and Hart both. And yeah, he was just kind of like the newer type of Western actor, more of the fancy dresser. And Wyatt mentioned to Hart, you know, that he would like to at least get a biography. In fact, Hart really worked with Wyatt getting an accurate biography of him. He talked to John Flood, who was a personal friend of Wyatt's, who actually wrote down his unpublished memoirs. Try to get those published. Really very valuable. I have a copy of that too. And but the Houghton Mifflin and other companies, they thought that John Flood, for all his good intentions, was a terrible writer, and he thought there's no way they could sell it. So finally, a few years later, they met this man named Stuart Lake, a young author, and he eventually was the man who interviewed Wyatt several times, and didn't get as much information from Wyatt as he wanted to, because Wyatt was always tight-lipped about stuff. He was wary about him, and then finally he trusted him, and then he got real sick, and then Wyatt died. It wasn't until after he died that Josie Earp, his wife, really wanted Wyatt to look like the knight on a white horse. And the book that came out in 1931 portrays that. This is part of a letter that Wyatt wrote to William S. Hart on May 4th, 1928. I have not forgotten your fine letter of December 16th last, and a copy of Literary Review together with the criticism of Bernard de Voto. And early in January, I was in receipt from a Mr. Stuart N. Lake, from his address. He writes in a modest and unassuming manner and explains that his material has been used by Saturday Evening Post, The Outlook, and others. Perhaps you are acquainted with him or know of him. Will you not kindly advise me in this? I love the way they wrote back then. You know, Wyatt wasn't a college graduate, but writing was just very fluid. It was really beautiful. So I was asking for his advice. One of the people that was very instrumental for me in learning about the Earps in San Bernardino County in Southern California was a man named Fred Holliday, no relation to Doc. But he passed away about 30 years ago. But he was one that really started writing about the Earps in Southern California. Dick Maloney, another good friend of mine, he's the one that was a descendant of Sarah Jane Rousseau, who let me see the original diary that his great mother, I guess, wrote in 1864, and I've got a copy of it. John Earp, another Earp descendant, he was a teacher. He was a football coach at San Bernardino High School, and he lived in the city of Rialto when I interviewed him. Very interesting man. He is probably related to one of Wyatt's uncles. His father had 4 brothers. The Earp boys, except for oldest brother Newton, which most people never heard of, he was a half-brother, none of them had kids. John Earp, interesting, he told me something about the family history and the genealogy. He also showed me a letter. This was from the either late 1950s or early 60s. And it was written by a young boy in England. And on the front it said, Wyatt Earp, USA. Somebody had been watching the old TV show with Hugh O'Brien, sent this out to Wyatt Earp, USA, and somehow got to John Earp in Rialto. So that's pretty good. Don Earp, he's another Earp descendant. He lives in Colton. He has 2 brothers, Zach and Cliff. They live in, I think Cliff lives in Apple Valley or Victorville. And Zach lives in Riverside, and Don lives in Colton. A lot of Earps around here. Jess Ross, Joan Cad Roberts. The woman in the middle, Joan, Cad was the last name of Nick Earp's last wife, Annie Cad Alexander. So I got some information about her. There's Robert Clyde in Lone Pine Canyon. I learned about the Earp-Clyde connection. This is when I showed that old house earlier, that Virgil Earp was good friends with Almond Clyde. He's passed on. And this is probably the last picture of Wyatt Earp, taken in 1926. And this is in black and white, but if you look at those eyes, what my friend Grace Bolidoro mentioned, that he had these steely blue eyes that could stare right through you. You look at those eyes, that looks like you could stare right through you. James Earp is buried in Mountain View Cemetery in San Bernardino. Delia Edwards, that's the sister who lived to adulthood, and her husband, William Edwards, are also buried at Mountain View in San Bernardino. Morgan Earp's grave is in Colton, California. The actual gravestone, or maybe it was a marker. They don't know where that was, if there ever was. I mean, there had to be a marker of some sort. So this monument was put there in around 1990. Virginia Ann, the mother, is buried in Pioneer Cemetery in San Bernardino. Again, her gravesite, or gravestone, or marker was missing, so they put a new one up. Wyatt Earp at 80 years old. Okay, this is actually his last photo. This is and he died 80 years and 10 months old. Those eyes, I think he still looks like those eyes that can stare right through you. His funeral, Wyatt died on January 13th, 1929. At the funeral was George Parsons, good friend of his in Tombstone. John Clum, who was a really good friend. He was the first, he was the creator of the Tombstone Epitaph newspaper, and also the first mayor of Tombstone. This is Bill Hart, William S. Hart, Tom Mix. And Wyatt Earp is buried with his wife, Josephine, in a Jewish cemetery. Her family is Jewish. They live in, the cemetery is in Colma, California. And that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer or try. Yes?
How accurate was the movie Tombstone?
Okay, how accurate was the movie Tombstone? I'd say by far more accurate than any movies before that. That movie, there are a lot of, what I really liked about it, I mean, for one thing, the costuming was great. The filming was great. There were a lot of true things. I thought the next year, 1994, the movie Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner, which is probably not as big of a box office draw, was probably more accurate. But they're both great movies, and it's a great, it's certainly far more than My Darling Clementine, which was a great movie, and some of the other ones, way back when. Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
Does Don Earp and his brothers still do the portrayal of the Earp boys?
Okay, the question is, does Don Earp and his brothers, if they still do portrayals of Earps? They don't, not so much now. They were doing that, in fact, some years back there was the Earp Society that they would meet, I think it was in Moreno Valley, and then they moved in Colton. However, Don does help me. Every October, with our San Bernardino Historical Society, we have a historic tour of Mountain View Cemetery. And we visit the grave sites of pioneers. And we have Mountain View supplies us with 2 shuttle trams. And anyway, one of the places we always go to is a gravesite of the Earps, where James is buried. And Don dresses up like an Earp. So that's the closest.
How many years ago, the Conference of California Historical Society had their, in San Bernardino?
Oh, yeah.
And then they
I was there.
where we were in some garage somewhere, and they did we ate there.
Oh, the Bloomington Garage. Yeah, I was a part of that. Yeah, it was
Well, we ate at your...
at the historical. That's right. Yeah. Actually, I met Andrew too, and that's yeah. That was about 2003 or 4. I remember it was a long time. It was quite a while. Yeah. We had talked about doing that again. I know the conference is supposed to come out, I think, in our area.
Next June.
Oh, okay.
This one, the Placerville is coming June.
Okay.
And the year from now, 2020, they're going to do the Route 66.
Oh, that's right. Good. Okay. Well, good. So you're involved with the conference, I take it. But okay. Yeah, that sounds good. That'd be great if we could do that again. But it was a great camaraderie having historical societies from all around.
Yeah, we did it here in Ridgecrest and in Trona.
Okay. Well, that's good. Sounds great. What's that?
The best one.
Oh, I bet. That sounds great. That sounds really wonderful. Okay, anybody else? Yes.
Why was there a gunfight at the OK Corral, and why was it in Tombstone?
Okay, why was there a gunfight in the OK Corral? Why in Tombstone? Well, as far as in Tombstone, it's because that's where the silver boom was. That's where the participants all were there. Well, the Earp boys, went to Tombstone. They were there to take advantage of opportunities. They're opportunists. Not necessarily becoming a lawman, but they want to make money. They want to make money and adventure. So Wyatt was working as a assistant marshal for Pima County, and just before about 1879, 1880, and then Cochise County was about ready to form a new county as part of it. The people running that want to both be sheriff was Wyatt Earp and Johnny Behan. Behan, they gave him a promise that if Wyatt withdraws and Johnny becomes sheriff, he would name Wyatt as his under-sheriff, and then he would take over. So it turned out Behan didn't do that. He hired, his name is Harry Woods, who was running a newspaper called the Tombstone Nugget. So that was a thorn in, the Earp side and, Johnny Behan's side. Well, I'd say the Earps. Also the fact that the Earps eventually were involved with law enforcement at a county level or local level, and they were involved with chasing down, Newman Haynes Clanton, Old Man Clanton, who was the head of the family, the old man that lived in Redlands area. He was accused of, he was killed because of stealing horses. His sons were also thieves. And then the clans were making threats against the Earps. So it was a matter of the clans threatening the Earps because the Earps wanted to run them out of town. And then you had this Josephine, Sarah Marcus, who was Behan's girlfriend. All of a sudden, she decides she likes Wyatt better. So it starts becoming a political deal as well as a personal deal. And finally, on October 26, 1881, Virgil Earp, at the time, was town marshal. He deputized Wyatt and Morgan and also Doc Holliday. They were walking down the street. If you saw the movie Tombstone or Wyatt Earp, it's pretty much the same. They're walking down to where the Clantons were, to tell them that they had to, give up their weapons. Give up their weapons or get out of town. Now, when they got there, they were in this alley. The alley was about 15 feet wide. There were 9 people altogether. In fact, at one point, there was, there was Ike and Billy Clanton, there was Tom and Frank McClowry, there was Billy Claiborne, there was Wesley Fuller, there were 2 more guys. And what was that one? Oh, okay. Anyway, so they got real close together, and there's no way in heck anybody's going to go out and like in the Old West, have a shootout when you have 9 people within about 6 feet of each other. Somebody made a motion to shoot. And it could very well have been Morgan. And some say even maybe Wyatt, but maybe Morgan. Morgan was a bit of a hothead. So Virgil actually had a gun, and he gave up his shotgun. He only had his cane. He said, "I don't mean that." And supposedly, all the people that saw the gunfight said, I didn't mean that. I don't mean that. But somebody made a motion, who knows, maybe somebody, I guess I would think of high anxiety. You're that close together. There's hatred, even the night before, and even that morning. There was Wyatt Earp buffaloed Tom McClowry. Buffaloing means getting the barrel of a gun and hit him on the back of the head. It's called buffaloing. So, you're that close together, and somebody could have just had an itch, could have scratched, who knows what they did, but all of a sudden, everybody shot. And within, they say, about a half a minute, it was over. And then 2 months later, as Virgil was, he got injured, but that was okay, it was superficial. 2 months later, he was on patrol, he was walking the streets outside of the Oriental Saloon, and he was ambushed. He almost died. They found out that the people that were involved were members of the Clanton gang. 3 months later in March 18th, Morgan was playing pool with Wyatt. And again, somebody shot from the back window and killed Morgan instantly. Again, members of the Clanton gang. And then right after that is when Wyatt went on his vendetta ride, and that was a case where, if you watch Tombstone, it looked like he shot about 50 people, but it wasn't that many. But they killed at least 3 or 4, and it was. But so it was it was in Tombstone because of what was going on, and also it was a personal and political rivalry. So it was. Yeah. Anyway, okay, thank you very much. Okay.